Welcome back. Today we're going to get into foreign policy, and we'll talk about the various foreign policy alternatives facing Central Asia from the beginning. And then this will bring us back into some of the discussions of empire with a 21st century spin. So remember, when Central Asia was born, it had significant regional problems that were international in scale. You had water resources, for example. I've already mentioned the Amu Darya drying up on its way to the Aral Sea. Well, that goes through Turkmenistan, and it goes it starts up here, and then it goes through Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, and then into the Aral Sea, which is shared by Kazakhstan. Here you have the Sirdarya, which starts in oh, does it start in Tajikistan technically? Yeah, and it doesn't go through Kyrgyzstan. It starts in Tajikistan, which is a major source of hydroelectric power. Goes through Uzbekistan, and then into Kazakhstan, and then into the Aral Sea, which is shared again by Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. So you have lots of issues, water issues, and you have the Naran River here, which also goes through multiple states and is siphoned off along each one. So you have water issues as one major issue, but you also have other ones. You've got the migration issue, people moving for jobs. Remember, these all used to be one country, and now suddenly they've got international borders. One of the guys who I mentioned before, my friend Ukdam, was actually born in Tajikistan, but he was living in Uzbekistan when independence came, and the Uzbeks didn't want to give him citizenship. Tajiks were in the middle of a civil war, and so he essentially became a person without, what do they call it? A person without citizenship, an uncitizen or so, I don't know. But you can actually get a UN passport saying I'm a person from nowhere. Not a lot of people want to let in a person from nowhere. You also have various cultural policies. Do you want to have similar alphabets in the region so we can all understand each other? Should we use the Cyrillic alphabet? Should we move back to the Latin alphabet, which we had before? Should we move to an Arabic alphabet, which we had a while back? Because all these things could facilitate regional links. Do you want to create a regional power here? Economically, you have major regional issues. You've got rail links and road links. A lot of them hope to go via Iran to the Persian Gulf? Or do you want to go to China? Or do you want to stay with Russia in terms of transport, and especially the gas and oil from Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan? What's the best way to get it to market? Should we develop links going through Iran to the Persian Gulf? Should we go through China because China is so hungry? Then you've got the security questions, big security questions, because you've got the threat of civil war, which Tajikistan demonstrated. You've got Islamic extremists here in Afghanistan, but going over borders and going into other parts of Central Asia, in particular Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. You've got loose control over nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan at first, and that was remedied fairly quickly. But you still had biological and chemical weapons that were in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan during the Soviet period and remained there afterwards. And so there was the question of how you actually secure these facilities now that Moscow isn't doing it, and now that borders are different and people going into your states are different, i.e. potential terrorists. So for many of these states, the question was, is the Commonwealth of Independent States the only logical way to go? And they could have opted for this confederate system, which is what the CIS really is, because stronger ties weren't really feasible, hence the end of the Soviet Union. But they could have also pushed towards a more regional system. The problem here was that they lacked money, they lacked military capabilities, and they were competing with each other in ways that they hadn't before. Historically, they had to get their resources from Moscow, and so they had to compete to a certain degree on that level. But now they were competing on the international arena. You had conflicting historical claims, which often meant that various borders weren't completely addressed. You had competing ambitions for regional leadership, especially between the Kazakhs and the Uzbeks. Again, the Uzbekistan being the most populous state and historically sort of the leader in the region, but Kazakhstan being the largest state and with huge oil reserves. And then you have the competition over scarce resources like water. And then, so it was essentially too common. You needed some sort of arbiter in the region to have, it's a regional system was really difficult. Um, and finally, the other option here was to just have sort of bilateral relationships, including with other states, go it alone. Um, and so let's look at the other states who might have been interested in being partners with these Central Asian states. Well, Turkey was among the first to show interest in the early 1990s. In the Turkish press, commentators, politicians expressed their interest in this once closed world because, look, these are our people. They're, except for Tajikistan, they're all Turkic speaking peoples. So why shouldn't we be close to them? These were new opportunities, but it also created new dilemmas. They offered military training and investment early on, but pressing for influence in Central Asia was problematic for Turkey for a few reasons. One, there was a question of identity. Turkey was a NATO and an EU. It was a NATO member and it was an EU aspirant. If it goes east, then maybe they're looking more to reconnect with their pan-Turkic roots. Maybe they have no future in the European Union. So that was an issue. If they're snuggling, if they're seen by the European Union as snuggling up to the bad guys, um, the Central Asians being really mostly dictators by the mid 1990s, well, that doesn't look very good for their chances of getting into the EU. So this was a complication for Turkey. Do we really want to go that direction? There was a rivalry also between Iran and Turkey would seen Turkey being in Iran's backyard was also something that would sort of raise the temperature there. Russia was also unhappy. There was a question if Turkey was simply an American instrument in the region, because after all, it was the most southern NATO member. Then for Central Asian elites, Turkey was also not entirely attractive. If you think about it, Turkey wasn't very successful at getting into the EU. It seemed a bit alone and not terribly powerful. So and on top of that, there were fears that if Central Asia snuggled up to Turkey, that they could close other geopolitical doors. So from the Central Asian perspective, this wasn't a perfect match. And then you had this Arab-Turkish conflict. The Saudis were also pushing into Central Asia, and they preferred to keep the Turks at the periphery of the Muslim world. So that was another one. So there were all sorts of problems with Turkey coming in. So there was initial interest from Turkey, and then it kind of faded for a while, but then it would make a resurgence. We'll talk about that later. What about Iran? Well, there are various possibilities and obstacles to cooperation. You have contiguous borders, strong cultural ties, and historical links, especially with Tajikistan. Iran also shared concerns with Russia and Turkey about coming in. It may be a good reason for Russia to align itself more with Iran because the Russians and the Iranians weren't crazy about Turkey moving into Central Asia. But Russia was also unhappy with Iran coming in because of religious rule and this land corridor to the west and to the Persian Gulf, which Iran would be, which would circumvent Russian supply lines for Central Asian oil and gas. Russia wanted to maintain control over these supply lines. If Iran cozies up to Central Asia and they create some sort of other route, well, then that's going to leave Russia in a bind. How about Pakistan? Why is this appealing or not appealing for Central Asia? Well, it's good to have Muslims band together against the massive Hindu India from the Pakistan perspective. It's also an alternative trade route to the Indian Ocean from the Central Asian perspective. But really, the Central Asians were not very enthusiastic. Traditionally, they weren't keen on Islam as a component in the state, and they historically were used to dealing with India, which had been more in the Soviet Union's sphere of influence during the Cold War. Pakistan had been more in the U.S. sphere. And again, cozying up to Pakistan may close doors by being pan-Islamist, for example. This might make China mad with its Uyghur population, who are also Islamic. So there's another problem there. The Arab world, I should say, sort of on the side, largely ignored Central Asia, even though these were Muslim countries. It was much more about cultural ties, Saudi Arabia in particular, pushing these cultural ties, and the occasional sort of, I hope the Turks don't make strong inroads there sentiment. But that was about it. The Arab countries didn't really go into Central Asia much. In terms of China, there are a number of areas in which we should expect to see China pressing for cooperation. First, you've got the Uyghur issue, which is a threat for secession, right? And the Kazakhs don't like secessionism either. What'll happen to their borders if the Russians decide to secede? You also have more than 1 million ethnic Kazakhs living in Western China. China's interested in expanding markets into the Middle East. Central Asia is bam right there on the route. In fact, when you think about the old Silk Road, Central Asia has always been on the way between China and somewhere. And China, of course, is energy hungry. It's got a huge expanding economy, and it's got insufficient resources of its own, as opposed to Russia and Iran, which have plenty of oil and gas. Now, going to the last group here, the West, it's important to remember that the West was really uninterested at first. Why? Well, first of all, only Kazakhstan had nuclear weapons, so this was something that, yeah, the West had to deal with immediately. But the Kazakhs fairly quickly handed their weapons over. They didn't want to be nuclear powers. But there were also very few specialists on this area, on Central Asia. Historically, these were states that, well, these states hadn't existed. So they were given very little consideration in the past. It's not like, we can go back to the Uzbekistan, the Kazakhstan of 50, 60, 70 years ago before the Soviets took over. Well, these weren't states before. You also had the closed nature of the Soviet Union, which led to not a lot being known about certain potentially attractive features, including the chemical and biological weapons programs there that did make Central Asia attractive partners for the West because we wanted to get in and stop those things from going places they shouldn't go. In other words, clean up the sites. We had no idea about the political structures and where elites wanted to take these countries, which was another issue. They seemed undemocratic. They had really very little to offer us. And so we could often beat up on them. They're sort of a good thing to kick around. There were lots of other countries that weren't democratic, like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait at the time, that we really needed, that we really liked, thanks to their oil supplies, etc. So we wouldn't beat them up on human rights, but we could easily beat up the Central Asians. So they became sort of a good safety valve. We speak up for human rights, and here's Central Asia. Watch, we're going to speak up against Central Asians. Later, though, we developed a very keen interest, and we'll get to this a little bit later. So, given these things, the CIS became the likely choice, and it was the only obvious one at first. Well, the answer to why is that, look, you had very broad regional dependencies. You had these trade routes going, interlocking Central Asia with Russia. You had a common political culture. You had a common language, Russian. You had common institutions. These things all function the same way. Each one of these states was an old Soviet prototype, functioned on the old Soviet prototype. You obviously had geographic proximity to all these states. Later, you had already come so much further with these states that it was harder for faraway states to make serious headway. Our natural trading partner, our natural security partner, isn't going to be NATO. It's going to be whatever we've got within the CIS, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which we'll get to in a couple minutes. So as these ties get stronger, it becomes more and more difficult for each of these countries, except for this one, really, to get in. And the reason this one, China, got in was because of security interests primarily at first, too. So all this brings us back to the notion of empire and the threat of renewed imperial rule. But I'll take this in a separate set of slides.